I think the most surprising part was for me, and the thing that was kind of an impetus for me was just that there were no instructions for like how to do this. That's honestly the driver for why I started doing any of this at all, was I was like, this is something that literally happens to everyone and it should not be this hard.
When Becky Robison lost both her parents, she turned her grief into something remarkable, deadparentswhatnow.com. What started as her personal navigation through loss has become an essential lifeline for many dealing with one of life's most challenging transitions. Known for blending raw honesty with unexpected gallows humor, Becky's approach cuts through the noise to deliver practical guidance when it's needed most. Her work has caught the attention of major media outlets, earning her features in Business Insider, Salon, WNYC, The Conversation Project, and many more. Today, she's here to share invaluable insights on preparing for the inevitable, managing the unexpected, and finding her way through the aftermath of losing a parent. We'll also get an exclusive peek into her highly anticipated book coming in 2026. Please welcome Becky Robison to Talking Retirement. Let's dive into this important conversation. All right, Becky, I really appreciate you jumping on. Very funny, eye-catching website, deadparentswhatnow.com. I told everybody at the office I was interviewing you, and I told them the website, and they were like, this is the funniest thing we've ever heard. But how did you make this website? Like, what drew you to make the website deadparentswhatnow.com?
Well, partially just because I have a gallows sense of humor about things. But what I was having a gallows sense of humor about is that in 2020, my mom died of liver disease. And then shortly afterwards, in early 2023, my dad died of pancreatic cancer. I ended up being executor of their estate. And I had no idea what I was doing. Nobody tells you how to do those things. I expected grief, but I did not expect paperwork. So I asked my friends' parents, I asked my aunts and uncles, I asked the internet, and it was really hard to find information about exactly what I should do. Like, here's a will, I found a will, where do I even bring this will? Stuff like that. But I am a writer, and I am an avid note taker, so when I'm in meetings, I take notes all the time. And I tweeted one day, back when Twitter was still a thing I used, I tweeted, would anyone, if I made a My Parents Are Dead, What Now guide to this situation, would anyone want that? And it kind of went semi-viral. That had never really happened to me online, but it did that time. People kept getting in touch with me about their parents or how much they wished they'd had something like that when their parents died, or they wished they could use it now because their parents were sick. So I figured, if all these strange people on the internet have confidence in me, I can have confidence in me as well. And I have a lot of eldest daughter energy and just want to fix everything myself. So as I was going and learning how to do all of this stuff, I took notes, I put them up on the website and created deadparentswhatnow.com. And it's still going. It's an accidental job I created for myself.
Yeah, I was going to say, obviously you got a book coming out, which we can talk about. But
yeah.
When I was doing my research on you, I saw you'd been in Salon and iHeartRadio. You talk about going semi-viral on Twitter. Did you ever expect that all these people would be reaching out to you to make content for them, appear on shows and everything? Like, it's interesting to see such a really cool acceptance and people wanting to hear the story.
No, yeah, I mean, obviously I hoped it would help people, but I did not expect someone from WNYC to reach out. That's what happened. They didn't even see my website. They knew about my tweet from several years ago and tracked me down and reached out to appear on WNYC. And I mean, when I created the website, I did not necessarily expect to get all the attention from editors, which is how I ended up with a book deal. So yeah, no, it's been kind of a wild ride. It's one of those things where it happens, and I had obviously hoped it would be helpful. I did not realize quite how helpful it would be. Yeah.
Have you found that, before we dive into what you actually do when your parents die, have you found that the humor has made it more accessible? Because I find as a broker, people don't want to talk about life insurance or passing away or long-term care because it's such a heavy subject. Do you find the humor aspect kind of ices people down and makes it so they're more okay with it?
I think so. I mean, that's certainly how I cope with most difficult situations in life, is that, like, I have to laugh at myself or else I'll cry. But I also think, there's some sort of, there's like physical aspects of crying that help you when you're struggling. But I think there's also physical aspects of laughing that help you when you're struggling similarly. So for me, I find that the humor really does help me get through these difficult times. And from the people I've spoken with, at least, who appreciate my work, they seem to kind of latch onto that as well. Yeah.
That's awesome. So the question becomes, your parents are dead. What now? What are some of the tips you have given people that have really resonated with people through your own experience?
Oh my gosh. So many, so many things. I mean, I obviously, the first thing I would say is if your parents are still alive, there is a section on my website for if your parents are not quite dead. And the first thing would be if they are still alive, you should try to talk with them about not only what they want to happen when they die in terms of, what kind of method of disposition, that's the fancy way of saying what you want to do with your body. So not only what, whether they want burial or cremation or what have you, but also monetary things, because I think money is just as taboo in our society as death a lot of the time. So, I never had conversations with my parents. I knew they wanted to be cremated, but that was kind of it. We never sat down and had a conversation about what kind of assets I'd be dealing with as executor. They never told me why me, like, why are we making you the executor? And what do we expect you to do with our estate after we die? They just sort of left the documents there and I guess hoped I'd figure it out. It's just really overwhelming. So if your parents are still alive, explain to them that even if it's an awkward conversation, they're making your life easier by having those sorts of conversations with you. And there are lots of good resources out there besides mine to help foster those conversations. There's a really great website, organization called The Conversation Project, and they have a bunch of talk guides on their website to sort of lead these conversations and get into them. So that's the first tip. If your parents are still alive, talk with them. I guess another tip would be, and I mean, we could go through so many of these. I guess tell me when to stop giving tips. But
As many as you got, go for it.
Yeah, I feel like there's sort of a reluctance. I think millennials and boomers are in very different places in life, and when they reach certain ages, or at least monetarily, there's generally quite a large gap. By the time my grandparents died, for example, my parents had kids, they had a house, they had various retirement funds, they had all sorts of things going on. So they had worked with financial advisors, they had worked with lawyers, they had worked with insurance agents. And for me, I did have insurance, but you do a lot of it online sometimes, or you don't necessarily have an agent, or I had never hired a lawyer to do anything. I did not know how to hire a lawyer. I do not know how to pay a lawyer. I do not know any stuff like that. So I guess what I would say is it can be really intimidating to do those sorts of things, but especially when it comes to probate and going through your parents' estate, if you're the executor or you're a successor trustee for a living trust, yeah, you do want to hire you want to hire a lawyer. You don't want to do it yourself. Yeah, there might be some rare cases where it's so small and simple that you can do it yourself, but that's kind of unlikely. A lawyer is going to make your life a lot easier. And I think people wonder, oh, where do I get the money to pay the lawyer? It's the estate, like your parents' estate is how you pay the lawyer, like the money that they've left behind. Because I think that's a concern that people don't realize. Speaking of which, you don't inherit your parents' debts. So, people can come. Yeah, it's great news, right? You don't inherit your parents' debts. If they have credit card debt or something, those companies can come for the estate, but they can't come for you personally. So if your parents didn't have enough money in their estate to pay those credit card bills, that is too bad for those creditors. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a worry too, is people say, oh, I don't know how much there is because we never talked about it. What if I can't pay these bills? Good news. It comes from your parents' money, not your own money. Your money is safe. None of this affects your personal credit. None of this affects your personal money, although it certainly will affect your personal time, because it does take a lot of time and effort to do that work.
Yeah. I think, like you said about the conversation earlier, I know my parents have assets. I know they have wills. I don't know how to access any of them. So this conversation is like, you should do it. Passwords to banking accounts.
Oh my gosh.
You have the ability to access those bank accounts. You have access to the legal documents. Were you able to successfully have that conversation with your parents before they passed, or was this
No, no, none of that really. Literally, when my dad realized that he wasn't going to make it, he told me the name of his lawyer. So then I knew who to go to, who I have to say was not the most helpful individual. When I went to see my dad's lawyer after he died, I think it wasn't so much like he's a bad person or bad, it was more just like talking past each other, because I didn't really know what questions to ask, honestly. I thought I could go in there and say, hello, my dad has died. Tell me everything I need to know about his assets and what he has left. And I also think this lawyer, after years of practicing as a lawyer, there's certain legalese, there's lots of industry jargon. And so I remember, for example, asking him, my parents had a living trust, which in theory helps you avoid probate court, although I didn't really know that at the time. I just said, oh, okay, so they have a living trust. So like, what is that? What is the trust? And it was just, we were sort of talking past each other because he didn't know that I wouldn't know what a trust was or didn't really know how to explain it. And I remember saying, well, how do I know what's in the trust? Like, surely you have paperwork saying what is in the trust. And no, as it turns out, if it's your trust, you're supposed to be writing down what assets you put in there. So there should be documentation if you, for example, put like a property into a trust. The deed would say that the trust is the owner. And for example, anything that is in a trust would be addressed to the trust in the mail. So it would come to your parents' house or your house if they're having the mail forwarded, but it would be addressed to the trust. But I didn't know that. So it was very hard to have that conversation, because I was like coming in, like, explain to me like I am a baby what's going on. And he, I think, didn't really know how to do that, or didn't really know that that's what I needed. So it did end up involving a lot of work. For example, you're supposed to sign an acceptance of trust when you're the person who was the trustee dies and you're taking over as the successor trustee. He didn't have me sign one of those. So I was just doing the work for several months without knowing I had to do that, until the lawyer I hired for another reason having to do with his estate set me straight. So luckily, my sister and I get along great. Nobody was coming in to challenge any of my decisions, so that was fine. But it could have been bad.
It could have been really bad.
Yeah, it could have been terrible. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I find as an insurance professional, sometimes someone comes to me with a question I've answered 500 times, and I have to take a step back and realize, okay, I've answered this question 500 times, but this is a very unique and important question to this person. And I think a lot of times people lose sight of, you have to treat everybody like this is the first time they're dealing with it. Just because you have 50 times the past year doesn't mean that person doesn't deserve the patience and the respect and everything.
And that's something I constantly worry about doing this work, because, of course, when I started this whole journey, I didn't know anything about it. And now I've put tons of time into researching it. As you said, I have a book coming out in early 2026 based on the website. So for book research, I became a death doula and I trained as a death doula and learned how to do kind of end-of-life care work. I audited an estate law course through University of Louisville. A kindly professor let me virtually audit his class one semester. So something that I constantly worry about is just having to make sure, like, I'm still coming from this perspective. Not that that auditing one class gives me years of training as a lawyer or anything, but just making sure that, because as I'm becoming familiar with this language that they might use in the legal profession or that they might use in the medical profession, that I don't put that, that I explain everything I am going over clearly, so that people who are just starting out in this space understand what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, and I think you're really good at making everything more accessible. And like you said, avoiding all the legalese and speaking in plain, mostly funny English, which I think helps out. Like the whole living trustee, it could be a 6-hour law course, or you could explain it in one sentence like you did, which is very good, Yeah,
trying my best. Yeah, it gets a whole chapter in the book. Well, wills and trusts do, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you want to talk about the book, I know you said it's coming out in early 2026. Is it done? What's the focus going to be in the book? What are you going to cover?
Yeah, so it's almost like an expanded version of the website. And whereas I tried to organize the website chronologically, like, okay, my parents are not quite dead. What should I ask them? Okay, my parents are dead. What do I do right now? As I'm they have just died. What is my next step? The book is organized a little bit more like by subject, I guess. So you still have that beginning, my parents aren't quite dead chapter with what you should ask them. And also I go into a lot more information about hospice or what you should do in other situations where your parents might be ending their lives. And then it sort of moves on to different subjects by chapter. So you might get methods of disposition as a chapter, what to do with a body, different ways you can dispose of a body. There's a chapter on wills and trusts, for example, and what you should do there. That was honestly, I think, the hardest thing for me. There's a chapter now about wills and trusts, and there's a chapter about other financial aspects. And these things are so related, like you need the will or the trust to do certain things, that it was hard to parse out exactly what should go in which chapter sometimes. But I think we got it figured out. The whole draft is done. We've done developmental edits on it. So now it's sort of in the back end of the publishing process, which is kind of this weird, slow process where it goes to a million different people. So right now the copy editors are taking a look at it, and they'll do their whole copy editor red line thing and tell me I grammatically used something weird, and we'll figure that out. And then it'll come back to me and my editor, and we'll do our edits based on that. Design has to get their hands on it, put some cute skeletons in there, make it look really cool, actually lay it out how it will be laid out as a book. It has to be printed eventually, that part has to come. So it does take a while when you're doing traditional publishing. But I'm so excited to be working with Quirk Books out of Philadelphia. When I heard that they wanted to publish me, I was familiar with some of their other work, and their books are not only great books in general, but they look awesome. So I am very excited for how this book is going to appear in the world.
Are you going to get the spray pages? Like, my girlfriend's a big fantasy reader, so a lot of those books have like the sprayed pages. Have you ever seen that?
Oh, yeah, I don't know if it'll have that, but I think it'll have some pretty cool diagrams and stuff like that. I know we're just going to have some sidebar sections. There's going to be some checklists. I don't know. It's going to be very nicely laid out, and I am pretty excited about it. I studied creative writing as in graduate school. And this is not how I thought I was going to get a book deal. Let me tell you, this is not what I thought. I studied fiction. I was writing fiction in grad school, and here I am with a self-help book. That was just really not where I thought this was going. But that's kind of how life works, right? You never know.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the guys at NJ Life and Health, we spent our 20s making music or doing other careers.
Yeah.
And if you told us when we were 27, hey, man, you're going to love Medicare, you'd be like, absolutely not. And then, you find something you're passionate about and it takes off.
Mm-hmm. And then you become really weird at parties because you're like, let me tell you about this fascinating quirk of a state law, y'all. And people are like, why are you talking about this? Don't.
Yeah. Someone's like, is that the Dead Parents website, girl? Like,
yeah.
What do you think is the biggest thing people don't prepare for? We can talk about, the conversation before, the conversation during, the conversation after. How do you think people get blindsided the most when their parents are passing away? Like, what are some one or two common things you see which are like the biggest headaches for people?
I mean, I think one thing is, I don't know if it's a headache, but it's a really emotional thing, is it's really helpful to tell your kids what you want to have done with your body if they don't know, because then they're sitting there thinking, oh God, my parents never told me what they wanted, and now they will hate me for all eternity if I decide to cremate them and actually they wanted to be buried, and people don't know a lot about these things in advance. And there's a lot about the funeral industry, actually, that people don't know. I think a good thing for people to know before they go to a funeral home is that the FTC does have its funeral rule to protect you. It's gross to think of yourself as a consumer when your parents are dead and you're trying to, make financial decisions about what to do with their body. That's gross. It seems horrible. But in fact, you are a consumer in this situation and you have rights. Not that funeral homes are trying to scam people right and left. That's not how it works. But they will, for example, try to get you to buy a coffin or an urn from that funeral home. If you've decided to go with them for body preparation. And you do not have to. If you find a cheaper coffin or casket or urn or whatever online, or you don't even have to use an urn if you have a really nice pot that you like, you can, I've talked to people who found them at Michael's, and craft stores and stuff. But you can use that. They legally cannot tell you can't use it. And for example, embalming, a lot of people think that needs to be done to a body, but it actually legally, in every state, you do not have to embalm a body. You can have a funeral at home if you want. People don't know that. They think you have to go through a funeral home, and that's not necessarily true. Now, I'm not saying you should have a funeral at home. It's, again, very much up to you. But, that's something we did for hundreds of years. People had funerals in their own homes, and now it's become completely not industrialized, but, sort of a corporatized situation. There wasn't a funeral industry before. That only happened after the 1800s. I'm rambling now. You can see that I've learned too much about this subject. But yes, I would say a big one is if you can talk with your family about, if you can tell your kids, even if you can leave instructions with your will about what you'd like to be done with your body, that's really helpful, just so that they're not worried that they're going to do the wrong thing. Knowing that you have rights when you go to a funeral home. It would be helpful to know what assets there are, even on a broad basis, to know what exactly do you own, because sometimes there are kind of surprises in there. My parents were both small business owners. They worked out of a building that my dad had designed, and they had sold their businesses before they died. I did not know that they were still in the process of selling that building. So when they died, it was like, oops, extra building. So, extra building that's part of the estate. And luckily, that was not a super big deal for me. My mom's business partner is still very much alive, and he was well aware of what the process was for selling that to the new owners of the business. So it was pretty easy to figure out. But that could happen to you, where there are just certain things that you don't know about. Do your parents have cryptocurrency? Did they buy a Bitcoin at some point? Hope you can find that key. Stuff like that. So it's really important, if you can, to at least know what kind of assets you're dealing with. And then I think the names of any accountants, lawyers, that sort of thing, because you can hopefully get, if you can't find certain information of your parents, hopefully you can reach out to them afterwards, and, insurance agents as well, hopefully reach out to them afterwards and get the information you need about various policies or, wills, trusts. A lot of people keep their original copy of the will with their lawyer, and you need that original copy to file it with probate court, that sort of thing. So, yeah.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I mean, it's cool to see your passion. I know you're like, I'm rambling, but it's cool to see such a serious topic be not only taken with humor, but also a seriousness too. Did you find the building part of all this, finding that your parents owned a building, was that the most surprising part of the process for you?
I think the most surprising part was for me, and the thing that was kind of an impetus for me, was just that there were no instructions for how to do this. Honestly, that was it. The building, I was surprised, but after I thought about it, I was like, oh, I guess that kind of makes sense, that they had been working on this other thing, and they just hadn't finished because they were doing the sale slowly. They knew the people who they had sold it to. So, it was a separate thing. So I was surprised at first, but it was more of a momentary surprise. I think the biggest surprise for me was that in this moment of horrible grief, and I'm very lucky to have what I describe as an aggressive support network. My two best friends came from out of state in one of their cases and lived with me for 3 weeks to make sure that I was doing okay and help me out cooking and all of that. But in the midst of this horrible grief, you are suddenly expected to make these really big financial and legal decisions. And nobody tells you how to make those legal, they were just much bigger legal and financial decisions than I had ever made about anything. Funerals are not cheap. So, suddenly my dad is in his literal deathbed, and the wonderful hospice workers were like, look, we looked up all the funeral homes around here and their average prices for you, but you have to call around. So my dad is dying, and I'm on the phone shopping for who will take care of his body. It's so weird. That's not something you want to do, but it's something you're going to have to do. So it's helpful to either know what they want in advance or start looking in advance and just learn how to make these decisions. So for me, that was the biggest surprise, was just, oh my gosh, this is so much more work than I expected. I mean, I was so lucky that I was able to, at the time when I was still doing my full-time job at an insurance company, actually, I was able to I was working remotely anyway, and my manager was awesome and understood that I needed to run out to the bank in the middle of the day to do weird tasks related to the estate or whatever. A lot of people don't have that ability. You know, I had 5 days of bereavement leave, and that's very generous. There are a lot of, nobody's mandated to give bereavement leave. So, and 5 days is certainly not enough time to do everything you need to do with someone's estate. So, it's just a lot. I was surprised by the level of work and the level of like financial and legal knowledge I was seemingly expected to have out of nowhere to complete these tasks. To me, that was the biggest shock, and that's honestly the driver for why I started doing any of this at all. I was like, this is something that literally happens to everyone, and it should not be this hard.
Yeah, and it's interesting you said, like, it's such an emotional experience. Like, even if you didn't have to do any of it, it would still be incredibly, incredibly hard. And do people, and you can use yourself as an example, did that emotion and that grief, like, make all these already hard legal and financial decisions just like feel heavier? Like, does it become more stressful, compounding?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely makes it much more stressful, and you sort of doubt yourself because you're kind of in this fever dream of like, what is even going on? And your friends making you food and just all of these things, and like people are flooding your place with flowers, and it's just a very strange time and space. And so you're really sad, you've got all these emotions going on, and then you have to be very careful about exactly what you do to make sure you're doing everything the right way, and you probably won't. For example, when we were filling out, to get a death certificate, for example, that's a good tip. You're gonna need about 10,000 death certificates, and they do cost money. You're gonna need, get at least 10 to start, and you'll probably need more than that. But to get a death certificate, when you're working with the funeral home or crematorium or whatever, you'll fill out paperwork and they'll actually file for it. And then you get the death certificates from them. So my sister and I filled out that paperwork for my dad. He was a snowbirder, so he had a home up in Wisconsin and a condo down in Florida, and he had died in Wisconsin. So we put his Wisconsin address on that paperwork. That was not his legal address. His legal address was in Florida. So we filed that paperwork, and then we were trying to do things, and they said, you have to refile the death certificates with his legal address on them. So I had to pay extra to get them corrected by the state of Illinois where he died. Yeah, it was a whole mess. So, and that's just, if I had maybe not been really, really sad and overwhelmed, I might have thought, we should check which one is his legal address. But that didn't occur to me because I was just trying to figure out what to do in the first place and get it done, and also not fight with my sister and and take care of the dogs and take care of other just like regular daily living stuff, the dogs. Yeah.
I was stumbling across your website before we hopped on, and I think the thing that was the most interesting was my parents are dead, but I can't prove it. When does that come up where you can't prove that your parents have passed away?
So that specifically has to do with death certificates, which I talked about a little bit earlier. They really are probably the most important part of settling your parents' estate because you can't do anything without them. You cannot get into their bank account without it. You cannot, even to file a will with the probate court, you need the death certificate. If they have any retirement accounts, if they have a life insurance policy where you're the beneficiary, you need to prove it with a death certificate. So there's going to be this period of time where, you go to the crematorium or funeral home, they file that paperwork for you. Depending on the bureaucracy of whatever office is issuing the death certificate, it totally depends on the state. So sometimes it'll be the county that issues it or the state that issues it. It'll say at the top of the certificate which office issued it. But I think with my dad, it took 2 weeks, but sometimes it can take longer. It can take a couple days. It can take a month. So until that point, you can't really start any of the work. Working on the estate. So you kind of have to figure out other things you can do in the meantime. Like it's probably a good time to plan a funeral or start cleaning out the house, that sort of thing. Although you got to be a little careful. For example, if the will says certain things are supposed to go to certain people, you don't want to throw that stuff out, for example. But, if they have a bunch of expired vitamins or something, you can probably get rid of those. And letting people know certainly about it. But yeah, death certificates are so important. Like I said, you're probably going to want to start with at least 10 because you will need them to close every single account. Like the cell phone company is going to need a death certificate. If you want to close their Facebook account, you'll probably need a death certificate, or at least some kind of proof that they really died and that you're in charge of their, digital legacy now. So you can sometimes ask for death certificates back. Like sometimes if you use one to do something, you can say, hey, when you're finished with whatever you need to do, can you give it back to me? I think their bank gave that one back to me, but that doesn't always happen. A lot of times they just keep it. And so you're out, it costs between, I believe the last time I checked, it was generally between $6 and $25 for a death certificate, depending on where you live. Here where I live in Louisville, Kentucky, it's $6 in Jefferson County, but where my dad died, it was $12 for a death certificate, and you pay that much for each one. So it can get pretty expensive. So if you can get them to give them back to you, that's great. I guess the quote unquote good news is you can get more of them. You still have to pay for them, but if you get 10 and that's not enough and you need more to close more accounts, you can either go back to the funeral home that you used and ask them to get you more, or you can go directly to the office that issued it and ask them for more, depending on what's easier for you. Usually if the funeral home gets them, you can go pick it up at the funeral home, that sort of thing. The government place will probably mail them to you, but I've had to get both. I had to get more for my dad, and even though my mom had died earlier, sometimes her name was still on certain joint accounts. So I had to get her death certificates, get some more of those too, years later, so that I could close out some other stuff.
Yeah, no, it's such a crazy process, and I know these companies obviously have to dot all their I's and cross all their T's.
Oh, of course, they would
ask,
Yeah, they would totally get sued if they didn't ask for all, they're obviously covering a certain amount of risk by making sure that this person is really dead, so they need the legal death certificate. It's just, it's hard to get them. Like, it's not hard to get them, but it takes a while, and you need a lot of them, and it costs money. And obviously you can pay for that with the estate money. So again, and you might not have access to that right away because you need a death certificate to get access to that money, but you can pay yourself back if you have to pay for death certificates. Or that's a good thing to know too, is if you have to pay for the funeral up front, you can pay yourself back with the estate money afterwards. Once you get a hold of it, depending. I mean, obviously there are. I am not a lawyer, and I do not want to speak for every legal situation because but yeah. Generally you can pay yourself back from the estate money.
Nice. Something we talked about briefly was bereavement leave, and bereavement is definitely a word I knew before we started talking. I really didn't, but how can companies better help their employees? I know obviously it's very much a basic, hey, give them space, give them time. What are some policy level things companies can do to help their employees out during this grieving time?
Well, first of all, if they're not giving them bereavement leave, I think they should give them bereavement leave. That I think would be a first step because it's not federally mandated. So a lot of companies do give bereavement leave, but a lot of them don't. And I think if you're not giving your employees bereavement leave, you cannot imagine, not only, because I think companies think about it as, oh, they're just in pain, they're just grieving, and they need this time to grieve. And it's like, no, they actually need to do a ton of work in this period of time, especially because they're probably planning, at that stage, it's probably because they're planning a funeral or a memorial of some kind. And that is a ton of work. Hopefully you have a funeral director to help you if you're going through a funeral home, or if it's a religious ceremony, someone at the church can help you. But it could be that you're doing a lot of this work on your own. My parents were not religious, so my sister and I did a lot of that work on our own, and it was a lot of work. It's basically like planning a wedding, except sadder, and you're doing it more quickly. But you need a lot of the same things. It's true. You need like flowers, and you need a florist. You need to figure out how to invite people to the funeral. A lot of people just do word of mouth, but for COVID, my mom's was a year later, so we actually sent invitations so people would know, and that sort of thing. So there's various time differences. But yeah, I mean, honestly, it can get to the point where you're sort of planning like a mini wedding that is sad very fast. And so it's like a lot of work to do in 5 days. You probably need more than 5 days, but I get it, they're a company. But if you're not giving any bereavement leave, that's bad. You should give them some bereavement leave. And then I think if there's just any way you can help provide resources. I mean, obviously I'm biased, I have online resources, but if you can provide any sort of resources to employees, just in terms of helping them understand how insurance works, or like how to file a life insurance claim, or understanding, if you can offer mental health services to your employees, that's wonderful. The company where I used to work did. We were able to get therapy, a certain amount of sessions free through work, and that was awesome. So, obviously that's very helpful in a time of grief. So if you have any resources like that you can help out your employees with. And I think just understanding that they may need some flex time, especially if they're an executor or a trustee, hopefully, they trust their managers enough that they can come to them with that information. And, just knowing that they're definitely going to need some flex time over the next year. Because even if they pay a lawyer to do everything, even if, your parents had a lot of money and so you can cover a lawyer just doing a ton of stuff for you, there's still going to be a lot of stuff you have to sign. You have to do weird trips to the post office at random times. You have to, it's a lot of work. There's probably going to be property you have to sell. There's probably going to be, obviously a million accounts you have to close. So I think just giving your employees a lot of grace in the next year, and know that they're not necessarily trying to shirk on the job. They're just trying to do this thing that they're literally legally required to do if they're the executor of an estate or a personal administrator. It's literally if you're the executor in the will, that's your legal job that you got to do this. So, just making sure that employees have the space they need and the support they need to kind of get that done over the next year or two. Because it can take, the average estate's probably about a year to close. And if there are a lot of assets, it'll probably be longer.
Yeah, I know in New Jersey, probate court has to stay open for at least 9 months. So best case scenario, it's 9 months. And if there's any contention, it's probably going to be way more than that.
Yeah, and then not even contention. Sometimes stuff can take, my dad's estate is still technically open just because he had a trust. I shouldn't have even had to put anything through probate theoretically, but there were a few things he forgot to put in the trust. So I had to go through probate court in Florida for those anyway. So I had to open probate. I have to get in touch with all of these companies. Companies that issue stocks are hard to get in touch with and, figure out, how I'm supposed to get all of that stuff turned over. So there's just still these these weird little loose ends that I'm trying to tie up. And hopefully I'm pretty confident I can finish it up by the end of this year. But, so I'm rooting for myself here. I think I can do it.
Yeah, I'm rooting for you too. I think you
Thank
got
you.
this. But yeah, I think something that is interesting about your story is you talk about how it obviously didn't, nothing goes perfectly when your parents pass away, but it seems like you have a great relationship with your sister. You had a very aggressive support network, like you said. What are some support structures for people who may not have that built-in network of people? Do you have any resource recommendations if you're doing it on your own, if you have a more contentious relationship with your family, anything like that?
Let me see. So the contentious thing with family thing is pretty hard because if they take you to court, they take you to court, right? Sometimes the only way to resolve that is in court, but hopefully it doesn't get to that point. I would say if you have someone else in your family that can sort of operate as a mediator, it can be okay to sort of ask that person to throw themselves into the middle of situations, or even a friend that you trust, like a family friend, to sort of jump in there and try to help mediate things, because it can be contentious. I think sometimes, luckily this did not happen in my family at all. Like you said, I get along great with my sister. But, sometimes people feel like, oh, why did mom and dad make you the executor and not me? Are you going to screw me over? And it's you should be glad that mom and dad didn't make you the executor, because it's actually a ton of work. But yeah, there can just be a lot of feelings, not only about grief. Partially people deal with their grief in different ways. It's people, one man's trash is another man's treasure. You might think it's not a big deal to get rid of that weird spoon that was dad's, but actually your sibling really wanted that spoon or whatever, so you got to be careful with that stuff. If you have another family member or friend that can kind of step in there and help mediate, or, if you can take the space and time to kind of get a little air before you do certain things, that can be really helpful. In terms of grief, there are a lot of really awesome grief resources, actually. Obviously, if your parents died in hospice, the hospice should be able to give you grief resources. They probably have a support group, that sort of thing. Obviously, you can go see a therapist, but there are so many good online grief resources. Grieve is one of my favorites. I was able to interview Rebecca Feingloss, their founder, for my book. She's awesome. But they have a great website with grief resources for everything, not just death, but like, I lost my job, I'm sad about it, or I just got out of a relationship and I'm sad about it. So they have all this grief. That website is awesome. Grieve is great. But there are so many others. You can find support groups in your area. You can find support groups online. You can find support groups for different ages. So that's, really great. Because I think sometimes you hear support group and you're like, oh, am I going to sit in like a church basement with people that I don't really know? And it's just like, oh, I don't know that that's for me specifically. But you can, online, it's great. You can kind of find a support group. You can find queer support groups. You can find all sorts of stuff, Look up, like on Instagram or whatever social media you use, look up grief resources and you will not stop finding stuff. There's really, that space has really taken off, which is one reason why I focused less on grief in my work, just because I was like, well, what else can I do that these amazing experts aren't already doing? I think where I kind of settled was more of the logistical aspects, just because grief was being covered so much already. But I would say in terms of support, everyone's going to ask you if they can help. You are not required to make up tasks on the spot, but if someone offers to help, say thank you. If I think of something, I will let you know. And then when you do think of something, let them know and ask them to help you, because, honestly, like you can't do everything yourself. It's too much work. So, if suddenly you realize, oh shoot, it'd be really helpful if someone could order groceries for me this week, and your friend offered to help, just be like, hey, I hate to ask, but could you do this? Because unless they're a real jerk, they probably will, and it will be fine. I'd also say it's okay to have fun. Like, even, I think sometimes people feel guilty about doing anything else, like, oh, I should wear black all the time and be in mourning because this horrible loss has happened. And that's right, a horrible loss has happened, but you do have to go on with your life, and you're allowed, if something makes you laugh, that's okay, you're not a bad person. If you watch a funny movie, or if you go out with your friends and you have a laugh, that's okay. That's an okay thing to do. You are perfectly right to do it, and it will probably help you heal. My friends and I played Twister. They literally brought the game Twister to my house, and we played Twister like while my dad was in hospice, and honestly it helped so much. It was just like a really completely ridiculous thing to do, and so over the top. It was great. But there's a very funny picture of me playing Twister in my pajamas somewhere from that time. Yeah, I mean, in terms of flowers, everybody's going to try to give you flowers. If you can point them to a charity, like think of a charity your parents would have liked, then tell them to make donations there. Then you won't have your own botanical garden in your house. That can be helpful. And everybody's going to want to bring food. And if you don't want them to, you can just say, I'm really sorry, I don't have any room in the fridge. It's okay to tell people what you don't need as well, because I think, that's a big comfort thing in our society. People want to make food and give you food, and that makes sense. But it is also okay to be like, I am really sorry, I don't need any food right now, but I will let you know if I can think of something where you can help in the future.
Yeah, that's a cool, healthy boundary, because you don't want to also feel the pressure of getting people involved in the process if you don't necessarily need them. So I think that's an interesting boundary I wouldn't think to set, that sometimes you got to tell people I don't need help. Yeah,
it's weird because they all want to help, and that makes sense. If, when my friends are sad and they are in grieving, I want to help them too. And so I think it's just important to ask how you can help, and also give them space to take the time to think of how you can help. It may not be something where you need to rush in right away. It may be something where, a few weeks or a few even months down the line, oh, this task hasn't been happening. I haven't cleaned my house because I've been doing all of this work. Can you please come help me clean my house? That sort of thing. So just, give people space. In terms of grief, it's always good to don't just say, I'm sorry for your loss if you can. Be more specific. It's okay to talk about the loved one. It's okay to say things like, God, I loved your dad. I loved when we went golfing together, that sort of thing. You're not going to hurt people more. In fact, it'll probably be really nice for them to hear sweet memories of the people they lost. So, it's okay to be more direct about a loss. You don't have to be weird and cagey about it.
Yeah, I had a cousin pass away a year ago, and I was very sad because he was pretty young, great guy, and at the funeral, my other cousin told a pretty funny story about how he had pressured him to talk to his future wife. Basically was like, go get her. And he's like, I
Yeah.
never would have, been with her. And, for how serious everything was, I think we all had a smile on our face because of those good stories. And like you said, it's good to not sit there and, I don't want to say wallow. I feel like that's a pretty mean word, but,
Yeah.
think of the positives that person brought to your life.
And there's no wrong way to grieve. If you need to wallow in that moment, like, yes, wallow. Like, if you need to crawl up into your bed and lay in the fetal position for like 2 days, do what you need to do. Like, that's grief is going to hit everybody differently, and it's going to hit everybody differently at different times. Like, you could be totally weirdly fine for the first couple of weeks, and then like 2 months later you hear a song that your dad really liked and you're suddenly bawling at a mall or something. It's just it's really different for everyone. So don't feel bad if you're like not grieving in the quote unquote correct way, because there is no correct way to do that. And it's not like a neat little tidy progression where, oh, I'll just get less sad over time. That's not how it works. You're going to be sad at some times and happy at others, and you're going to forget your parents died and want to call them on the phone and then remember that you can't call them on the phone. It's like, it's so nonlinear, and that can be, I think, kind of disconcerting for people, but it's something that you'll get used to, and your life will sort of grow around it, and you'll find new things to love and new people to support you and new things in your life, and it'll always be there, but it won't be the main thing always.
Yeah, and the phone thing's actually interesting you brought that up. I've had several people tell me it hits them because they talk to their parent almost every day, and they go to call and they keep forgetting. It's such an interesting dynamic. It's like the little things that really tip you off, oh, things have changed in a big way.
Yeah, I always used to talk to my parents on the phone when I was walking my dog, and it was so weird the first few months after they died, because I would want to call them, and I was like, well, who do I talk to when I'm walking the dog now? Like, no one my age likes to talk on the phone. I just called them because it was a good time to call mom and dad, and I called my sister once, and she's like, why are you calling me? I was like, I was like, okay, maybe not. I don't know. But it was funny. I put something about that on social media once, and a bunch of people were like, you can call me while you're walking your dog if you want. It was really sweet.
You got that aggressive support network. It's good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was really.
Well, Becky, really thank you for all your time. This is great stuff, funny, introspective, and also super resourceful. So I know the book is coming out in 2026, but what are some of the goals you're going for with the website and with the business in 2025?
Yeah, so you've kind of caught me right at the beginning of this business adventure. I quit my job in the middle of last year to sort of focus on this full time, and I'm still kind of building things out as we go. So the book is coming out in 2026. Right now I have a weekly newsletter called the Columbarium, which is one of those buildings you see in a cemetery that has a bunch of little niches inside of it for urns, and my newsletter also has a bunch of little niches for different things, so I thought that would be a good name. You can sign up for that on my website. It's free. It'll just keep you, I talk about the history of death and dying because I studied history as an undergrad. I think it's really interesting. So I try to tie in the history of things with practical advice about death and dying. And then I put in some industry news, some other things in there. So that comes out on Tuesdays. You can sign up at deadparentswhatnow.com/newsletter. And that'll keep you abreast of what's going on, with the business and also with the book. Then this year, what I'm hoping to do is have some kind of low-cost downloadable items for people who are really going through it. So I'd love to do a eulogy writing guide that I'm working on, an obituary writing guide, that sort of thing. And then ideally, what I would love to do eventually is start consulting with companies, both in the death industry, to say, hey, millennials are your customers now. How can I help you help us? And what do you need help with that you would like maybe a millennial's help with? How can I help you there in terms of communicating, in terms of saying, you're our first point of contact after someone dies and we probably don't know what we're doing. You can be sort of a referral business for us as well. So, working on that with death industry companies, but then also with other companies to talk about, hey, what do your employees actually do on bereavement leave and how can you help them? So that's the eventual big picture goal. But like I said, we are just right at the baby steps here at the beginning of making all that stuff happen. But it'll all be on the website as it goes.
Yeah. Well, again, I thank you so much for your time, Becky. It's so cool to take such a serious subject and somehow make it very fun. So I give you the credit in the world. We've been trying for years to talk about these things, but it's such a heavy conversation. So the fact that you can turn it into something that people can laugh about is a very valuable thing. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Yeah.
Deadparentswhatnow.com. I think we're catching her right before she blows up. So be sure to check out the website. Tons of great resources, tons of great stuff, and tons of great comedy. So thanks again, Becky.
Thank you.